heartbroken, but not surprised, is an act of genocide in itself. Canada could and should do more.
Важливо, коли політики, які проживають та працюють на іншому континенті, щиро та з позицією підтримують Україну. Це проєкт Joint Efforts Canada&Ukraine спільними зусиллями до перемоги. Я Оксана Мельник і ми розпочинаємо. Сьогодні у мене в гостях канадський політик українського походження Джеймс Безан. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!
Сьогодні наше інтерв'ю дійсно буде особливим, тому що будемо з вами говорити про Україну, так, про Збройні Сили України і про ту історію, як канадський уряд, власне, допомагає Україні. Моє перше питання – 24 лютого 2022 рік. Власне, ця дата, коли в Україні розпочалось повномасштабне вторгнення. Яка ваша була реакція на дану новину?
I wasn't surprised. We saw this coming, and ever since Russia, invaded Donbass and annexed Crimea, when I was actually on the Maidan,
Yes.
when Russia and little green men showed up on the streets in Crimea, we knew then that Putin would not stop. And so when the troops started to amass along Ukraine's borders in late 2021 and early 2022, I was calling on our government to send more lethal weapons, to get them in the hands of Ukrainian soldiers so that they could defend Ukraine. And so when the actual invasion took place, I was heartbroken, but not surprised.
Це дійсно не був сюрприз ні для українців, ні для нашого народу, адже ми завжди розуміли, що в нас є ворог. Не сусід, а ворог. Скажіть, будь ласка, чи були у вас особисто сумніви на той момент, що все ж таки на Україну нападе Росія? Чи ви були переконані, що ця історія буде мати продовження і Росія здійснить напад на мирне населення?
I always expected that ever since they were fighting essentially a frozen conflict in Donbass, that they were going to ramp it up at some point in time, that Putin's arrogance and conceit would take hold, and he would want to have a solid victory. I guess the surprising thing in the attack is that they went for Kiev, and they were trying to cut off the head of government. Ultimately, the resilience of all Ukrainians is what turned back the troops. It was turned back the invaders. And the barbaric actions, the atrocities committed by the Russian soldiers on Ukrainian people is something I think sickens us all. We feel very, angry about this, and that we have to hold Putin, his henchmen, and the entire Russian military to account for their war crimes and the genocide that they're committing in Ukraine. I think it's not only deepened the resolve of Canada, who is home to over 1.4 million Ukrainian Canadians, myself included, it has deepened the resolve of all NATO members to put our full support behind Ukraine so that they can defeat Putin once and for all.
Як ви вважаєте, чи достатньо на сьогоднішній день канадський уряд підтримує Україну?
I've been saying since 2018 that Canada could and should do more. We've been calling for the delivery of lethal weapons since 2018. We've been asking Canada, as the official opposition, calling on Justin Trudeau and his Liberal government to send more military materiel, especially armored vehicles. And they waited until the 11th hour to actually finally deliver. And the same is true for most NATO members. I think that the more armored equipment that we can, this is a tank war, it is only the way that you can defend against the Russian Federation. Putin's war machine is, completely unrelenting in wanting to grab up their thirst and hunger for more Ukrainian territory, that rich Ukrainian soil. Of course, he wants that and the resources that's underneath it. And the sad part of this is that he's prepared to use, young Russian men as cannon fodder. Their blood is now drenching Ukraine, from one end to the other. But that's their calculated risk, and they're the ones that are prepared to go to the front, and they're the ones that are prepared to commit atrocities against the innocent people of Ukraine. Then we have to continue to take a strong stand. So yes, Canada needs to send more armored vehicles. We have surplus light armored vehicles that can be sent up that already proven to help liberate the city of Kharkiv. And so if we can send more of that type of equipment, more of our tanks, and while at the same time buying new equipment for Canada as well, so that we are on a war footing and ready to go in case this becomes a bigger war than it already is and involves the rest of Europe. We have to make sure that we're prepared and that we have Ukraine on the best possible footing to defeat the Russian invaders.
Нам завжди потрібно три речі, про які, власне, завжди говорить наш президент. Це санкції, кошти і зброя. Рік війни позаду. Чи готова надалі Канада дійсно потужно підтримувати Україну до її перемоги?
I don't see the support from Canada unrelenting. I think that the Canadian public, definitely the diaspora here in Canada, and all political parties are ready to stand shoulder to shoulder with Ukraine. And that means that we're going to continue to send financing to help support the Ukrainian government. We'll continue to look at ways that we can possibly support the Ukrainian economy. And of course, we're going to continue to provide military equipment. Ukraine is prepared to battle. Canada, even though we're a large geographic country, we are not that large in population or overall in our military capabilities. And so what we have contributed on a per capita basis is a lot higher than most nations. And even still, I think we rank in the top 5 of all the donor nations. I have to thank all the donor nations that have stood up and supported Ukraine, especially the United States, especially Poland. And we're seeing a change in philosophy in places like Germany and other European countries. And the more that we can have that united front of allies supporting Ukraine in this war, the greater chance that this thing can end, and hopefully sooner than later.
Я хочу вам подякувати, оскільки ви дійсно різко і потужно висловлюєтесь за Україну, за підтримку України в своїх парламентських зверненнях. Чи підтримують Україну ваші колеги? Що відбувається в кулуарах парламенту?
So as someone who is a proud Canadian and a patriotic Ukrainian, I can tell you that I've always put Ukraine high on my priority list as an elected official. I also know that most of my colleagues, whether in the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party, the NDP, or even the Greens, who are normally pacifists, also want to see Ukraine succeed in this war against Putin and his war machine. So we need to continue to make those inroads. One of the things that we have to tackle here in Canada, and it's the same thing that's happening in Ukraine, the same thing that's happening all over Europe, is Putin's propaganda. The disinformation, misinformation campaign by Putin and his proxies resonates here as well. And I hear it almost on a daily basis, either in my social media content, the trolls hitting on me, whether it's even constituents talking to me. They believe some of the BS that they see on social media. And so, the internet was supposed to empower us all, but it also gives an unfair advantage to those that want to spread propaganda. And for those that are out there actually taking stuff that's coming out of Putin's trolls and from the troll farm in St. Petersburg and pushing it onto YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and other platforms here in Canada and around the world, they are what Putin would call useful idiots. And we have to make sure that, we don't want to undermine freedom of speech and freedom of expression in Canada and in freedom-loving democracies around the world. We do have to make sure that we're out there correcting the record. And so anything that we can do, including setting up a task force here on Parliament Hill to quickly correct the misinformation and disseminate what is actually the facts, would be, I think, empowering not just only for us as parliamentarians, but for all Canadians and people that want to make sure that the lies that are being spread by the Russian Federation are ended.
Дійсно, Путін – це є пропаганда. Як ви вважаєте, оскільки світ підтримав це твердження, мені цікаво, чи підтримуєте ви також? Путін – терорист?
I believe that Putin is definitely funding terrorist activities in Ukraine. There's no question about it. We know that the Russian Federation is responsible for terrorist actions in Syria, in Africa, in Georgia. They all need to be held to account. That's why it's important that we set up a special tribunal to go after Vladimir Putin and all of his henchmen in the Kremlin, in the Duma, in the Russian military, including the Wagner Group, and making sure that they all pay for their crimes against humanity. They pay for their crimes of aggression against Ukraine, and that we can drag them in front of the International Criminal Court where they can be actually tried for the world to see. Only then, I think, we'll have the ability to have retribution to Ukraine for the destruction of lives, destruction of infrastructure, the destruction of an economy, and rebuild, that we'd have a proud democracy again in Ukraine that can function fully without that Russian, corruption and interference that we've witnessed for all too often in Ukraine's history.
Ви були одним із 13 кандидатів до так званого чорного списку Путіна в 2014 році. І вас внесли, власне, до цього списку. Яка була ваша реакція?
I wasn't surprised because I've been active in Canadian media, doing lots of interviews after the little green men started showing up in Crimea. And then, of course, the hot war that broke out in Donetsk and Luhansk, on the whole basis that they were out there liberating the territories. But I can tell you that I'm proud to be, on the ban list by Vladimir Putin. I wear that as a badge of honor, and it shows that I'm not only standing up for Ukraine, but I'm standing against all the corruption and the atrocities and the human rights abuses that happen in Russia because Vladimir Putin leads the largest criminal organization in the world.
Чи обговорювали ви дане питання, так, і дану історію, яка була у 2014 році зі своїми колегами? Адже не тільки ви були віднесені до даного списку. Яка була їхня реакція?
So there was 13 of us that were on the list, 11 of us in Parliament. And we all were, I think everyone was going that weren't on the list going, how do I get on the list? Now almost all parliamentarians, of course, are on Putin's blacklist. So we, saw this as a sign that Putin was getting desperate. I think that one comment that I made, as well as Prime Minister Stephen Harper at the time, was that one person that was on that list was Paul Grod, who was president of the Ukrainian Canadian Congress at the time, KUK. Paul was put on the list just because of his ethnicity, because he was Ukrainian, a proud Ukrainian. And we thought that was deplorable, that people would be targeted just because of their secondary nationality.
Понад рік Росія потужно запроваджує інформаційну пропаганду. Так? І ми бачимо, що Канада минулого року також підтримала Україну і саме закрила російський мовник, так, наклала санкції на канал Russia Today. Яка ваша думка щодо інформаційного фронту? Як Канада надалі буде підтримувати Україну? Адже надзвичайно важлива правдивість інформації.
We are concerned that there is still the ability of different Russian propaganda agencies like RT, like Sputnik, that can still penetrate on the internet. I don't believe in censorship. I do believe in making sure that we correct the wrongs and put out the facts. So we need to have a more robust system to counteract the misinformation that Putin is pushing through his different state-controlled news agencies. And I'll just do the air quotes on that so everybody understands that, we don't consider them true news. We see them as what they are, and they're propaganda agencies. So we are looking at ways that Parliament set up a task force, the Government of Canada should be, but also using a lot of traditional agencies, think tanks, people and would more likely trust, because there is, as we know right around the world these days, a great growing distrust in government. And so we need to make sure that we're using all the tools that are available so that those that may not trust the current Liberal government can turn to and say, okay, this is a fact that's actually coming from an academic source or some other type of non-partisan, unbiased source of information.
Якщо продовжити наш з вами далі діалог про дипломатичний фронт, як ви вважаєте, чи змінився, чи змінилось ставлення до України світу з 24 лютого 2022 року? Як наразі світ сприймає Україну? Ваше бачення?
I would think that historically Ukraine has seen a very positive light here, especially in Canada, because a third of my riding identify themselves as Ukrainian Canadians. That's over 30,000 people in one electoral district. You compare that to the 1.4 million Canadians who also say they're of Ukrainian descent. That means that almost every other Canadian grew up in a community where their best friend at school was someone of Ukrainian heritage. And so they've always had this adoration for Ukraine, as my Baba and Guido called it, the old country. But there's always that respect, and that Ukrainians represent the same values and work ethic that we have here in Canada. So Canada was the very first country to recognize Ukraine's independence under Conservative Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. And we've completely supported that process right through, including trying to get rid of that Soviet-era corruption that still haunts Ukraine to this day, as we're seeing, deputy ministers and ministers being removed from government positions because of corruption. So whether it's perceived or real, Ukraine, under President Zelensky, has to address that issue to make sure they maintain that trust with Canada and other Western allies. They have to do it to make sure that, the people of Ukraine know that their government is serving them rather than government serving themselves. And despite all the great stuff that Ukraine's doing in the war and the allies that are supporting it, there's still that fundamental base is making sure Ukraine is coming up to those Western standards, especially when we start talking about NATO membership, EU membership, and that, none of us are perfect, but we need to increase the values within how Ukraine actually functions on a government basis. And it also, I always see this as a huge benefit. One of the false narratives out there is Putin is always spreading the propaganda that Ukraine is corrupt, and that's why he's going in, and Zelensky's the most corrupt president in the whole entire world at this point in time. By attacking corruption, I applauded Zelensky for doing this, because by attacking corruption the way he has, while he's attacking the Russian military on the ground, he's completely offsetting Putin's narrative and building trust back in the West.
Thank you. Наразі в Україні далі гинуть діти, гинуть жінки і гинуть наші воїни. На вашу думку, чого наразі не вистачає Україні для перемоги? Адже війна триває вже понад рік.
Ukraine lacked a lot of military defensive capabilities at the beginning of this fight, and it's getting better because of the supplying of air defense systems and surface-to-air missiles and making sure that we can shoot down these drones. You can't change the genocidal nature of the Kremlin and the Russian forces, but what you can do is better equip proper defense. And ultimately, we have to provide the equipment, and I'm glad to see that both Canada, the U.S., and other allies are providing more robust military equipment, like tanks, like shorter-range missiles that can go out and push back the Russian forces, including in the Black Sea. And the more that we can do that, the less chance of these drones flying in and attacking water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, going after apartment buildings, and the indiscriminate bombing of hospitals and schools. And it still breaks my heart with what happened in Mariupol at the Opera Theater. We need to make sure that all those tools are available, that the Ukrainian forces are trained up, so that we don't see those civilian deaths anymore. But these are all war crimes. They're all in contravention of the Geneva Convention. And so what we can do is make sure that those that did it are also held to account, so there's some closure for the families.
Крокуючи далі, не можу з вами не обговорити одного запитання. 39-те засідання канадського парламенту, на якому прийняли законопроект, який встановив День пам'яті жертв Голодомору та геноциду в Україні та визнав Голодомор в Україні 1932-33 років актом геноциду. Розкажіть про це більш детально.
When I was a young boy growing up, and we used to sit around the kitchen table and talk about Ukraine and our heritage and our roots, and how, you know, after Chernovitzy was captured by the Soviets finally, and we lost all contact with our family members there. We also had heard about the horrors of the Holodomor, which back in the 60s and 70s, you didn't hear much talk about. And then in Winnipeg and Edmonton, we started to see Holodomor memorials actually built to commemorate what that time we didn't know was 2 or 3 million Ukrainians had been starved to death by the Soviet thugs under Joseph Stalin. And when I got elected, we started having conversations on the Hill, including at that time Senator Raynell Andrechuk, about how we could actually move forward to recognize it, not just as a commemoration of what happened historically, but to call it for what it was, a genocide. And I believe that we were the first Western country to label the Holodomor as a genocide. And there was opposition in the House of Commons originally from the Bloc Québécois because they thought it was a step too far. And also from people on the ground saying, "Oh no, it wasn't intentional. Joseph Stalin didn't do it. It was a natural disaster, and it's sad that so many people starved to death, but there was a big drought." But we know as more of the data came out, as more of the records showed, both on the number of people killed and the weather patterns, and how the grains from rich Ukraine, the breadbasket of Europe, were exported out of the region. And how the false narrative also came out that was all part of collectivization and to get the rich kulaks off the land and put them on the trains and send them off to the gulags in Siberia. We know that this was an orchestrated government policy to Rustify, the Russification of Ukraine. And the way the Soviets were going to do that was, first of all, they went and killed all the political leaders, all the mayors, all the governors. They killed all the academics, people that could actually speak out about it. Yes. They slaughtered the clergy. All of it was done, you know, through public execution on the streets to scare the people. And then they went in and robbed every household of all their food. They robbed every farm. They took all the livestock. And they left people there to die. In 15 months, several million Ukrainians, man, women, and child, starved to death. That was done as a genocide. And using food as a weapon is deplorable. And what we witness today in Ukraine is the same mentality. It's about the Russification of Ukraine, especially Donbass and Crimea. And the false narrative that Putin is using is a throwback to Joseph Stalin.
Уточнюючи питання, так, щодо геноциду. Чи можемо ми вважати, що сьогодні аналогічно в Україні проходить знищення і геноцид українського народу? Як ви вважаєте?
I believe 100% what Putin is trying to do is rid Ukraine of Ukrainians. You know, he has called them little Russians at the same time that he's calling them our brothers and sisters. He has a dual narrative on everything he does as part of his propaganda. But he does see Ukrainians as a lesser people. So what he's doing is a genocide. What is happening on the ground right now, what we saw in just too many incidences of the killing of innocent civilians, including little children, is a sign again of his genocidal tendencies. The taking of children from Mariupol, from Donbass, from Luhansk, putting them on trains after he's killed their parents, and shipping them off to be adopted in Russia, to raise them as Russians, is an act of genocide in itself. All you have to do is read the UN Declaration on what constitutes a genocide. And Raphael Lemkin, who is the author of that declaration and who is the person that coined the term genocide, based his understanding on what happened in the Holocaust, what happened in Holodomor, and what happened in Armenia. And by taking what those purposes are, you actually define what is today happening in Ukraine. It's a genocide.
Thank you. Якщо брати до уваги 2023 рік, ваші прогнози, коли закінчиться війна?
I do have a lot of years in Parliament, and I have spent the better part of the past 10 years on the defense file, either as chair of the defense committee, as a parliamentary secretary on defense, as vice chair, and several years now as our shadow minister for national defense. And I like to always use those skills in looking at what's happening in Ukraine. I was just reading some reports this morning talking about what the next year does look like. And you have experts, that are experts in Russia, experts in Ukraine, experts in warfare and how this might play out. I would hope that the 500,000 conscripts that are amassing on Ukraine's borders right now from Russia are not successful in their push forward. We are definitely seeing a thickening of Russia's front line, which is going to make it more and more difficult for Ukraine to break through. But with the donations of tanks and other heavy weapons, I believe that the advantage can be Ukraine's. One thing that the Russians can never underestimate, but they do, is the tenacity and resilience of the Ukrainian people and the skills that the Ukrainian military have now, not only from their experience by fighting Russia for the past, really since 2014, also the training that they're receiving from NATO nations, including Canada, which we started when we were a government called Operation Unifier. Canadian soldiers training over 37,000 Ukrainian soldiers. And that training up to NATO standards has made a huge difference, because what we see on the ground coming from Russia is actually been shocking, that they aren't well trained. They aren't that capable. They don't know how to communicate between the different regiments that are fighting on the field. And because of that disjointed attack that they've had for the better part of the last 11 months, that's why they haven't been as successful as everybody first thought. So my hope is that Ukraine does push forward and liberates all of Kherson, Zaporizhzhia as well, pushes towards Mariupol, and isolates Crimea. I think the war in Donbass is going to be more difficult. But we, at the very least, I think Ukraine can stop the advances, the small advances that Russia's trying so hard to get after losing Kharkiv, and hopefully break through and push them right back where they belong, which is, in my opinion, right back to Siberia.
І крайній блок, який я хочу з вами сьогодні обговорити, це ваші зв'язки з Україною. Тому що ви дійсно підтримуєте Україну не лише починаючи з 2022 року, так і коли почалось повномасштабне вторгнення, а й до цього ви плідно, потужно і з позицією завжди підтримували Україну. Я бачу велику кількість нагород і хочу поговорити про них і про ваші зв'язки з Україною, оскільки також ми бачимо, що ви мали нагоду зустрітись з нашим президентом, колишнім Віктором Ющенком. Розкажіть, будь ласка, про це детально, так? Про ваші зв'язки з Україною і дані нагороди. Нам цікаво.
I've had the pleasure of meeting with many presidents, and I appreciate that President Yushchenko recognized my contributions for bringing forward the Holodomor and presenting me with Prince Yaroslav the Wise, a medal that only the president can do. I have had other medals provided to me by Ukrainian military factions, the Ukrainian Armed Forces, Ukrainian military police. The Cyborg unit gave me one of their medals because I have been unrelenting supporter of Ukraine and making sure that what I can do here as a politician is to continue to advance the issues of supplying Ukraine with the weapons it needs, the reforms that had to take place after the fall of Yanukovych, and include that, the aspirations of the people of Ukraine, their love for freedom, love for democracy, wanting to be more aligned with Western Europe. And I want to make sure that they fulfill those dreams and aspirations. Though I appreciate all this, I don't do this for the accolades, because there's been, many different types of awards from different diaspora organizations in Canada here as well. I do it because I love Ukraine. I am passionate about seeing a free Ukraine. And something that as a kid growing up, I desired Ukraine not to be part of the Soviet Union. And when it finally happened in 1991, I could tell you exactly where I was, what I was doing that day, and the joy I felt, and how my heart breaks today because of all the innocent lives that have been lost because of one madman's aspirations to capture a country that doesn't belong to him, and that's Vladimir Putin.
Thank you. Дякую за інтерв'ю, дякую за чітку позицію і за вашу щирість. Слава Україні!
Героям слава!